thanks for joining us for the 24-hour live stream component of .NET Conf. I'm going to be your host for the next couple of hours. My name is Aaron Powell, part of the cloud advocacy team here at Microsoft. And we've got a bunch of awesome speakers lined up for you for today. And we're going to be going through a whole bunch of content all around the globe, as Jeff and Javier were talking about before, to make sure that you can get the most out of building things with .NET. But you're not here to listen to me talk for the next however many hours they leave me in control of the studio. You're here to learn from our awesome set of speakers. So I'm going to bring our first speaker onto the screen and unmute his microphone for him. We've got Nick Randolph, who's joining us today. A fellow Australian here. So Nick's going to be talking about the Uno platform. And I had to check this. It was Uno, not Uno. So I wanted to make sure I got that right before we went live. And we're going to be learning about building cross-platform applications with .NET. So let me bring your slides and everything up onto the stage. I'm going to drop off. Do please drop questions into the chat for Nick, and we'll cover them off as the session goes. But Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the session covering some of the best practices for building cross-platform or multi-platform applications using .NET 8. My name is, as Aaron pointed out, it's Nick Randolph, and I'm part of the team building the Uno platform. And just to set some expectations on this session, this isn't a deep dive into performance tuning or optimizing app sizes. It's really about just looking at some of the best practices for building applications using some of reusable patterns to accelerate the rate at which you build applications. To this end, we're going to be taking a look at Uno extensions, which is one of the sort of additional libraries that the Uno platform offers. It's a derivative of the Microsoft extensions, and it's been heavily optimized for the Uno platform and to take advantage of some of the capabilities on particularly mobile, desktop, and web applications. If you're building for other technologies, so Maui, Apollonia, those sorts of things, you should be looking for equivalent kind of reusable patterns that you can take advantage of. For example, Maui also takes advantage of the Microsoft extensions, so some of the lessons out of this will actually apply directly to Maui. We're going to start off looking at some of the sort of the default extensions. So we're going to look at things like the iHost Builder, which is the building blocks for the Microsoft extensions that enables things like dependency injection, we'll add in configuration, logging, HTTP, those types of things. But then we'll also branch into some of the Uno specifics, so things like the navigation framework that we have. This allows sort of an abstraction or over navigation. So whether you're dealing with frames, tab bar, navigation view, those types of things, it means that you can basically use the same API across whether you're doing it in code behind, XAML, or in your view model. It's a very consistent API for doing navigation. We'll take a look at MVUX, which is a reactive sort of style take on or replacement for what was MVVM. We'll take a look at how you can write very concise code that's immutable by default, takes advantage of asynchronicity, etc. We'll use that to build out our application. And lastly, we'll look at adding authentication into our applications and how you can use the building blocks of Uno extensions to rapidly add in authentication without a whole bunch of the code that's normally required. To do all of this, we're going to take a look at the TubePlayer demo app or sample app that we've got. And we're going to build up some of the capabilities around, particularly around the extensions part, and look at how you can use that to sort of initialize your application. So let's switch across to demo. And before we jump into session code, I just want to take a quick look at the getting started for the Uno platform. When you download the extensions from Visual Studio, you can basically go ahead and create an Uno platform app. And once you get into there, you're presented with this wizard that allows you to basically customize your solution. So it allows a lot of these building blocks to be pre-configured and pre-set up to give you that rapid startup for your application. So we have sort of two presets here. So we've got a blank one, which is pretty much sort of a vanilla app. So basically, if you already know what you're doing, you know the pieces that you want to add in, you want to add in your own custom code, that's a great starting point. If you want to take advantage of a lot of the Uno extensions and you know which ones you want, or you want some guidance on what you should be selecting, you can go ahead and select the default. Both of these, you can click the customize button and go ahead and actually customize and pick various things. So we'll step through this and just give you an idea of the types of things that you can pick. So you can pick the target framework, so we'll go with .NET 8. We can step in, pick which platforms we want to support. So for example, I don't want to support GTK. We can pick the presentation technology. So I'm going to pick MVUX, but we also support MVVM. We can pick between XAML and C# markup. So I'll go ahead and pick C# markup. And there's a bunch of these other extensions that we can go through and pre-configure, including things for supporting testing and actually a default CI pipeline. So you can pick up a default pipeline for GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines, which just means that you're up and ready. You've already got something that's going to run in Azure, run in GitHub Actions, and actually build your application. Now, we're not actually going to finish this process here. What we're going to do is just cancel out of here. I'm actually just going to drop back to the command line. And here's the exact same thing we just looked at, but using a .NET New template. In fact, the wizard actually just drives the .NET New template within Visual Studio. And so here we're basically picking the Uno app template. We're going with the blank preset, and then we're going to add a bunch of stuff. So we're going to pick the .NET 8 framework. We're going to enable C# markup. We're using MVX with the material theme. We're going to enable dependency injection, configuration. We'll set the logging to be the default logger. We're using region-based navigation. We're going to enable toolkit. We're using MSAL-based authentication. We're going to add in HTTP, and we're going to add in a server library. And this is where we're going to have our API that we're going to then protect using authentication. And lastly, if you're used to .NET New templates, you'll be familiar with this. This skip parameter at the end basically just tells us not to do any sort of restoring, because we'll do that once we get into Visual Studio. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. And so this is a great starting point if you're going to use VS Code. You can basically run the .NET New template, and you get all of the same options that you would see in our full-blown wizard. Now that we've created that, I can go ahead and launch Visual Studio. And give it a moment to come up. And let's open our Solution Explorer and take a look at what's been created for us. So let's pin that open, expand out this. Okay, so we've got backend platforms, and we can see over here, we've got these various projects to support the different platforms we're going to be targeting. We then have the main application project here. And so you can see that there's been a number of folders and sort of libraries that have been added into this pre-configured for our applications. So we could go ahead and run this, and it comes with all of the things around authentication and all of that. But as part of a learning experience, what we're going to do is actually pull some of that away and actually go through the process of actually building up the configuration part of this. Okay, so let's just do that. So if I expand over here, you can see that this has got all our pages, so login page, main page, second page, etc. But the core of our application startup is in this app.cs. You can see here that we have our onLaunch method, and so you can see here that there's a bunch of code that's already been added for us as part of the template to enable things like logging, etc., etc. But let's go and actually just remove this for a second, and let's build this up slowly so you get an idea of how you can go about adding this to your application. Okay. Now, before we get started, I am actually going to just hop over back to our models and just remove a couple of lines that are going to cause us problems, because it's assuming that we're going to have these enabled by default. And obviously, since I've just removed that from the setup, it's going to blow up if I try and run it with these in there. So we'll just do that one more line there. Okay, so let's go back to our CS, and let's just go and add in some basic code just to run up our application. So for that, we're going to need a window, probably going to add in a frame and just navigate, just using the navigate method to our main page. Let's go ahead and actually run this up just to make sure we have a running application. And of course, this is going to fail on me because I haven't selected Windows as my target project. Okay, so basically, to determine which platform you're going to pick, you basically go pick the platform target and you go set a startup project. Now, I'm actually going to do something and unload these other projects. The reason I'm doing this is basically just for the speed of that developer loop, and every time I want to restart, and I don't have to worry about it going away and trying to do a .NET restore or anything like that on those other projects. So it's just going to be a little bit quicker. Go ahead and run this. It'll take a second or two just to build it, and we can see that in our output. Okay, it's getting there. And we should say deploy the Windows-based application. Okay, there it goes. And in a second or so, it will show up our main screen. And there we go. Now, because we removed all the initial configuration, none of this information is actually going to work. So I'm not going to be able to navigate to our second page or anything like that. But we're showing our main page, which is a good start. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of the Uno extensions are based on this concept of having a host builder, which generates or allows you to set up a whole bunch of things, and then it builds and then generates the host. And that's basically the sort of the core piece that actually brings together all of the services of our application. So for this, we can basically call the create builder method. And you'll notice here that this actually returns an iApplication builder. Now, this is specific to Uno platform, and essentially it's just a wrapper around the iHost builder that comes from the Microsoft Extensions library. It adds a few things like the ability to retrieve the actual application window, and does some initial configuration for the Uno platform on the host builder. Okay, so basically we can do that. We can retrieve the window instead of actually creating it. And then we call build on the host builder, and that generates our host. You might be thinking, okay, well, this is pretty boring. It's not really adding anything to my app. So let's go and add a few little bits and pieces to it. So from this, we can go and add in, so it's still calling our create builder, but now we're using a Fluent-based API to then go ahead and configure our host builder. So here, I'm basically going to set the environment variable when I'm in debug. Okay, so we can, it'll set to development. And when we're running our application, so once we have our host, down here, I can then go and retrieve that just using the services property. So it returns our iService provider. So you can think of this as our DI container. So I'm then retrieving the host environment from there, and I can query and take a look at the various properties on that. Okay, the next thing we might want to do is actually enable logging. Okay, so we can come back up to our host builder and actually add in use logging there. And again, when we're running our application, we can go ahead and do things like retrieve an iLogger for the current app, and then we can log out information, log out errors, etc. So the various log levels that you'd be fairly familiar with. Okay. Now, by default, we don't want to emit everything to the log output, and we probably want to make it somewhat conditional on whether we're running in debug or not. So let's go and change our configuration here. And we're going to make this conditional on, again, our hosting environment. So there's actually there's a method on there called isDevelopment. So that actually queries whether this has been set to development up here. And based on that, we can set the log level to either warning or error. Now, we can obviously lower that if we're in debug and trying to ascertain what's going on. The last thing we want to do is actually change the logging so that we can actually include some of the internal logging of the Uno platform. And we do that by, there's a flag at the end of here for enabling Uno logging. So what this means is all of the internal logging from the Uno platform will actually be emitted out into the same log information as the rest of the application. We don't do this by default because obviously there'll be a lot of information there that will obfuscate a lot of the logging that you would have by default within your application. But if something's going wrong and you want to analyze what's going wrong, you can enable that. And then you could basically set the various log levels. So here we're setting the core log level. So if I hover over there, you can see that the IntelliSense says that it's going to set the log level for Uno.star, Windows.star, and Microsoft.star. And there's a number of overrides there. And of course, you can add in your own filters as you would be using any of the Microsoft extensions for logging. Now, the next thing we're going to add into our application is we're actually going to add in a bit of configuration. Okay, so we'll do that by adding in use configuration. And here we're adding a couple of lines here. The first ones, we're actually telling it the source for configuration, or one of the sources for configuration is going to be our embedded source. And so here, these app settings.json, unlike for web development, where this would typically be a content file, here these are actually set to being an embedded resource. And we do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, performance, but second of all, for certain platforms when the file system isn't available synchronously, it means that we can basically read that information on app startup effectively because it's embedded in the application itself. The next thing we're going to do is actually register this app config. And so we've got a nice API for registering this section. And what we mean by this is we're basically going to assign this particular record to this section within the app settings. So here, that that's going to map to this section. It's automatically going to use the name of the class or the record to align with the section in the configuration. And what this means is that we can then access that information directly within our application when it runs by basically requesting an I options of app config. Okay, so you can see that over here. And when we retrieve that, we can then again query for this environment. And that will be, we look at app settings that we set to production, but then if we look at the development override, which you can see is collapsed here, that's going to be set to development. So when we run the application, we can actually see that that's going to pick up the appropriate value there. Okay, so let's go ahead and add something that's a little bit more adventurous. So right now we've just done the basics, we've done configuration, we've done a bit of logging. Let's go ahead and actually add in some HTTP. Okay, so by this we're going to add in this particular, we're going to use refit to assign or to bring in an API. So this API client basically defines the web API that we're going to be calling. Okay, so it's defining the sort of the relative path, those types of things. We have information in our app settings about the actual URL it's going to connect to. And then within our application, we can go ahead and retrieve an instance of that IAPI client. So let me just come down here, add in code like that. And essentially that's going to bring back our weather information, which is not obviously not particularly useful, but we'll go ahead and change that in a minute. Now, the last thing before we actually run this up is I want to make sure that when I run this, it's going to launch, and the URLs of the server project are going to align with what we're expecting for the client project. So for that, I'll jump into our launch settings, and I'll just confirm that the URL, so the secure one is 5002. Jump back into our app settings and just make sure that that is set correctly there. All right, the last thing we need to do is, before we run this, is actually go and make sure that we have both startup projects, so the server-side project and the Windows application are both set to start. So we'll go ahead and click OK on that, and we'll go ahead and launch them both. It'll take a second or two to come up. Okay, so let's just go through these things that we've added. So we've added configuration, and so if we hover over this environment, it should show us this kind of report on development. If I then step through this code, again, our environment, we can expand out that, and again, this is also set to development. We can see that as we step through the log, we're going to log out this information, and if I open out the output, you can see again that this is set to the error messages here. And then we can step through this, and I'll let this run, and it should go ahead and actually retrieve our weather information from the server. Okay, so I expand out that, you can see it's a success. And again, you can see the actual information coming back from our servers. Now, clearly, this isn't particularly useful. It's a weather service, and we're here to build a YouTube playing application. So I'm going to comment this code out, and we'll go ahead and actually modify our service to actually query out to YouTube. Now, one thing I didn't point out before is that we have this data contract library down here. And essentially, this is the classes that are used to serialize and deserialize the data coming and going to and from the server. So we've got weather forecast information, again, not overly useful. So let's go and add in some tube player information here. So let's go and add in class, tube player classes, because it's going to actually be a few different records that we're going to add in here. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of this. It's basically just a series of records that return information that we're going to use to basically pass information back from the server. On the server side, we're going to go ahead and add in a new set of APIs. So we're going to go and add a class in here for tube API CS. And again, we're dropping a bunch of code. The most relevant parts are this. So we've got our iYouTube endpoint. So this is basically going to be the endpoint that we're going to be calling on YouTube. Okay, so we're going to use refit to register that in a minute. And then we have our service API that our client application is going to call, so search videos. And we're going to map that onto as part of our program.cs using this map tube player API method call. So before we can do that, we'll need to bring in a library reference to refit. We'll just do that quickly. Browse refit. we'll do the HTTP client library, grab that. Come back to our program, and we're going to need to go ahead and register the refit endpoint. Okay, so we'll do that here. And we'll go ahead and add that using statement. Okay, and then the next thing we need to do is actually map our tube player API. So we'll come down here to where we're registering the weather. We'll add that into there for our tube player API. Okay, so that's the server side done. We switch over to the client side now. As part of our API client, we need to modify that to have our additional endpoint. Okay, so it's basically just extending our refit endpoint to include the search videos end. And then we're going to change our code to, instead of calling the weather API, we're now going to call the, where is it? Let's uncomment this for a second. We're going to call video endpoint. Okay, so I'll put a breakpoint just there. And we'll go ahead and run our application. And that should retrieve our instance of the IAPI client, and it should actually retrieve the list of videos now. Okay, so we'll see our application. We hover over videos, we can see that that's now actually returning our list of videos. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit now. We're going to go and add into the actual UI for our application. So we're going to come back up to here, and as part of creating the builder here, we're actually going to enable toolkit navigation. So this is basically enabling the Uno toolkit, and that's going to give us things like the extended splash screen. So it's going to give us a nice sort of progress wheel while our application is starting up. We're also going to come down here and enable navigation as part of configuring the host builder. So this is going to enable MBUX, and it's going to register the routes for our application. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and change this build method call to actually calling navigate. And it's going to navigate to the shell. Let's take a look at what's in the shell, go to definition on that. You can see that this is where our extended splash screen is defined. So if you want to customize that extended splash screen, you can do that in code here. And then you can see here, we've got a progress rail. I'm not going to spend too much time going into C# markup. I know that Pedro's got a session later on that's going to cover off that in detail. Okay, so that's our shell. Once the shell, or once our application is finished starting up, we need to tell it, the application, where to go. And to do that, we come down to our route table. And so you can see here that the route registration is made up of two parts. It's got view registration, so a combination of pages and models, and then route registration. So down here, this is basically the routes of our application. And I'm going to set the main model to be our default route. So we should be able to go ahead and actually run that application now. And it's going to give us our basic UI for launch the main page, similar to what we had with the frame and navigating to the main page. Okay, so looking a little bit better now. And the difference is that we now have things wired up correctly, so we can actually navigate on those. Of course, we still don't have any video data. So let's go and add in that information to our main model. So we'll go ahead and do that by replacing our existing main model with one that looks like this. So this is using MVUX to define a search term that's going to be two-way data bound to the UI. When that changes, it's going to have a condition to check to make sure that there is actually some valid search term in there. It's then going to return a feed that's paginated by calling our search API. Okay, so that's the model done. And then for the UI, we're going to switch across and launch Figma. And for this, we're basically going to launch from the Tube Play workshop. So this is going to open up the Figma file for the workshop. We can come down here. You can see that this is the layout for our screen. We'll go and grab the Uno platform plugin. And this will enable us to basically export out the C# markup for the specific page. So I can go here, I can go, let's go and select here, make sure our video feed is selected and hit refresh on there. Okay, so that's our C# markup. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, drop back to our application and my main page, replace that code there. Ooh. There we go. And you can see here that it's basically made up of things like a list view that's going to show our videos, and there's a text box, the data bound to our search text. Let's go ahead and run that, and hopefully we should have some video results. And there we go. And as I scroll down, you'll see that this will start progressively loading, loading more and more videos. And of course, I can go and change the text there, put my name in. And as you'll see, I don't have that many videos on YouTube. I'm some big guitar player. I think it's also got the same name as me. So it's got more tube videos up there than I do. Right, okay, so the last thing we're going to do is actually add some authentication to protect our backend. So we're going to, again, switch to the server side. We're going to go and add in, add in the identity library, Microsoft. So this will allow us to use MSAL-based authentication for and authorization for the server side. We'll go and configure this as part of the server side. So we'll drop in the authentication and allow it to do its thing. Just add in a couple of usings. And then we'll add in support for authentication and authorization here. Okay, so that's the server side mostly done. We just need to protect our individual methods. So we'll come across here to the two-player method or search video method, add in authorize onto that. And then the last thing we need to do is make sure that we've got our Azure AD information set up. So we're going to our app settings and just drop that configuration information to there. Then we need to switch to the client side to obviously enable authentication there. We do that as part of our host builder. So we can go up here, basically add in authentication, and we're specifying that we're going to use the MSAL provider. Go into our configuration. It's the default, which is created for us with some actual information for the client ID, etc. And then the last thing we're going to do is actually customize the startup experience so that instead of just navigating to the shell, we're actually going to change that to conditionally try and refresh our authentication token. And if we don't have an authentication token, it's going to go to the login page. If we do, then it will go to our main page. So I'll start that running. We should see our application. It should prompt us to log in now. Give it a sec to pop up. Okay, so here's our login prompt. And of course, we're going to get an error. Let's have a look at what I've done wrong. Okay, so we're getting unauthorized exception there, which is almost to be expected. Why are we not? Got all that information correctly. It should be there. Okay, let's just try running that one more time. So let me just turn exception handling off for a second. And this is the web version. Okay, so we're basically going to authenticate there, sign in, ignore the security prompt, and now we're hitting the authenticator service, and it's basically streaming back the same content we had before, but this time it's protected using MSAL. Okay, so we've seen a bunch of things in that demo. Here's some more resources for further information. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with the Uno platform, to take a look at some of the workshops that we have. Otherwise, grab across to the documentation. We cover quite a lot of detail on how to use things like authentication, the navigation service. And if you're not using Uno, I would highly recommend taking it out. But hopefully there's some takeouts from this session where you can apply them to other platforms as well. Of course, don't forget to download .NET 8. And with that, I'll hand back to Aaron.
Thanks, Nick. That was really cool. I haven't seen the Uno platform like in use. I'm a web person, so I don't do a whole lot of this native mobile stuff. But the simplicity in what you were doing and it really resonated very well to me as someone who doesn't have a lot of experience there. So I can see how this is really approachable for a lot of new developers that might be looking at how they can extend their application beyond a web platform that might be starting with and add a mobile component to it or a native desktop application and things like that. So yeah. Really, really interesting.
And what I didn't show there was, of course, that we focused on the Windows and the web application today, but all of that works across all of the target platforms, whether you're targeting Linux or iOS or Android or even Mac. Those recipes carry through to all of those, and we've done it specifically using the Microsoft extensions because we recognize people coming from the web world will be familiar with that for configuring their the server-side component. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, I said that was a great demo, a great guide for people who want to get started with. Definitely check out those resources that Nick had there, the bigger workshop that was a part of, and feel free to have a play around and get ready to build your own cross-platform applications. Thanks for joining us.
Aaron.